The waves crashed gently against the side of the luxury yacht, a soft rhythm in the darkened sky. Miles away from the shore, the air smelled of salt and freedom. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfect honeymoon getaway. But for Richard Lawson, this night was carefully planned, down to the smallest detail. He stood on the deck, gazing at the endless ocean, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from excitement. He was about to become a millionaire. His wife, Margaret Lawson, sat inside the cabin, sipping her favorite red wine. She was a stunning woman for her age, with silver-streaked hair and sharp green eyes that had seen decades of success. Margaret had built her fortune in real estate, working hard while Richard enjoyed the comfort of her wealth. He had no real job, no ambition, just expensive tastes. But now Margaret had unknowingly signed over her $2.5 million life insurance policy to him. All it took was a little trickery, a forged legal document, a casual mention of updating her estate, and the perfect blend of charm and manipulation. Margaret never suspected a thing. "Come outside, darling," Richard called, his voice smooth. "The ocean is beautiful tonight." Margaret smiled, finishing her wine before stepping onto the deck. She loved the sea, loved the freedom of sailing away from the noise of the city. Richard wrapped his arms around her from behind, whispering sweet words into her ear. And then, with a swift, merciless push, Margaret tumbled overboard. She gasped, flailing as she hit the cold black water. Richard watched, his pulse racing as her screams were swallowed by the waves. He had chosen the perfect spot, far from shore, with no witnesses. Margaret was gone. By the time he returned to shore the next morning, he had a rehearsed story ready for the police. A tragic accident at sea, his wife lost to the depths. His voice trembled as he spoke to the authorities, his crocodile tears falling freely. But what Richard didn't know was that this case would land on the desk of Detective Samuel Grayson, a seasoned investigator who had seen too many accidental deaths to believe in coincidences. The hunt for the truth had just begun. Detective Samuel Grayson sat in his small, cluttered office at the Newport Beach Police Department, sipping his third cup of coffee for the morning. At 52, he had seen enough cases to know when something didn't add up. And this one, a wealthy woman mysteriously vanishing at sea, it smelled like trouble. The report had come in earlier that morning. Margaret Lawson, 65, missing and presumed drowned. Her husband, Richard, claimed she had slipped off the yacht during a late-night sail. The Coast Guard searched the waters at dawn, but there was no sign of her body. "Another tragic accident," the younger officer on duty had said, shaking his head. But Grayson wasn't convinced. He studied the report carefully. Richard's statement was too clean, too rehearsed. His wife had just fallen in? Just like that? Grayson grabbed his jacket. He needed to meet Richard Lawson in person. The Lawson home was a modern waterfront mansion in an exclusive neighborhood, glass walls, a wide ocean view, and the kind of quiet that only rich people could afford. Richard answered the door, dressed in a crisp black suit, looking appropriately grief-stricken. His eyes were red, his movements slow. A man in mourning, or a man putting on a show. "Detective Grayson," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "Come in." The house smelled of fresh flowers and expensive cologne. Margaret's picture still hung above the fireplace, a smiling woman in her prime. Grayson took a seat on the leather couch, pulling out his notepad. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Lawson," he said, watching the man's reaction. "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to go over some details." Richard sighed deeply and ran a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Of course. Anything to help." Grayson leaned forward. "Tell me again, in your own words, what happened that night." Richard recounted the story exactly as it was in the report. How they had been drinking wine, how Margaret had stepped onto the deck, and how he had turned away for just a second before hearing a splash. "She was gone, just like that?" Grayson asked, raising an eyebrow. Richard nodded, his jaw tightening. "I jumped in after her, but it was too dark, too late." The detective scribbled something down but kept his eyes on Richard's face. He wasn't acting nervous. That was the problem. Most grieving husbands were a mess. This one? Too controlled. Margaret Lawson was a strong swimmer, wasn't she? Grayson asked. Richard hesitated. Well, yes, but then how does a woman who swims 3 times a week just fall in and drown? Silence. Grayson let the question hang in the air, watching Richard shift uncomfortably. I don't know, Richard finally muttered. It was an accident. Grayson closed his notebook. Of course, but I'll still need to take a deeper look. Standard procedure. He stood up and glanced around. Something about this house felt too untouched, too staged. As he left, Grayson's gut told him one thing. Margaret Lawson didn't just fall. Someone wanted her gone, and he was going to find out who. Detective Samuel Grayson pulled up to the Newport Marina, where Richard Lawson had docked his yacht, the Sea Pearl. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the calm waters. The boat had been impounded for the investigation, and Grayson was here to see if the evidence matched Richard's story. He climbed aboard, his trained eyes scanning every inch of the deck. No signs of a struggle, no broken railings, no spilled wine, nothing to suggest Margaret had tripped or slipped. Too perfect. Grayson crouched near the edge, where Richard claimed she had fallen. He imagined the scene. Margaret standing here, perhaps enjoying the view, then suddenly going overboard. Did she scream? Did she fight? If she had, there would be marks. Scuff marks, fingerprints, something. But there was nothing. A thought gnawed at the back of his mind. Margaret was a seasoned swimmer. If she had fallen in, she would have fought to stay afloat, at least long enough for Richard to attempt a real rescue. Yet Richard claimed she just disappeared into the dark water. That didn't sit right. Back at the precinct, Grayson met with his assistant, Officer Lisa Carter, a sharp-eyed investigator who had been with him for 5 years. She had already started digging into Richard Lawson's background. Found something interesting, Carter said, dropping a folder on Grayson's desk. Margaret updated her life insurance 3 months ago. Guess who the sole beneficiary is? Grayson opened the file. Richard's name was right there. $2.5 million. She had a brother, right? Grayson asked, recalling a mention in her file. Why didn't she leave anything for him? Carter smirked. That's the best part. She originally did. The previous policy had her brother, Daniel Whitmore, as the main beneficiary. But 3 months ago, Margaret changed everything. The money goes straight to Richard now. Grayson leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just a tragic accident anymore. This was motive. The next morning, Grayson paid a visit to Daniel Whitmore, Margaret's younger brother. Daniel lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, far from the wealth his sister had enjoyed. When he opened the door, his face was hardened with grief. Detective, Daniel said, stepping aside to let Grayson in. His house was simple, cozy, a stark contrast to the Lawson estate. I know this is hard, Grayson said, but I need to ask you about Margaret. Anything you can tell me about her relationship with Richard? Daniel scoffed. That leech? Margaret was blind to it, but I wasn't. Richard was charming, sure, but he was lazy. She paid for everything. His cars, his watches, his business ideas that never went anywhere. Did she ever suspect he was using her? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know, but she did something strange a few months ago. She called me and said she was rethinking her will and insurance. She said Richard had been pushing her to sign some documents. Grayson's pulse quickened. Did she say what documents? No, but she sounded uneasy. That was all Grayson needed to hear. He left Daniel's house knowing one thing for certain. Margaret hadn't fallen. She had been pushed, and Richard Lawson was running out of time. Detective Samuel Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. Margaret Lawson's financial records, will, and insurance policy changes. If Richard Lawson had orchestrated his wife's death for money, the proof would be in the details. Officer Lisa Carter entered the room, holding another file. I pulled Margaret's bank records. You're gonna love this. Grayson opened the folder and scanned the transactions. Large withdrawals, unusual spending, and multiple wire transfers. Looks like Richard was bleeding her dry, Carter said, crossing her arms. Margaret withdrew over $250,000 in the last 4 months. Most of it transferred to joint accounts Richard controlled. The money disappeared almost immediately. Grayson frowned. What was he spending it on? Carter flipped a page. Real estate deals that went nowhere, failed investments, and, get this, a down payment on a house in Miami. Grayson's brow lifted. Miami? Yep. Just 2 weeks before Margaret's death. Looks like Richard was planning a new life before she even hit the water. Grayson let out a low whistle. That's bold, Carter smirked. He's an idiot. He thinks no one's watching. Grayson tapped his fingers on his desk, deep in thought. Margaret's death wasn't spontaneous. Richard had planned it. The financial moves, the insurance update, and now a new house. He was getting ready to run. But Grayson still needed hard evidence. Any security footage from the marina? He asked. Carter shook her head. Nothing useful. The cameras near Richard's yacht were either broken or accidentally turned off. How convenient. Carter nodded. But I did find something else. Margaret's lawyer, Eleanor Price, called the precinct this morning. She said Margaret came to her weeks before her death, concerned about something. She wants to talk. Grayson stood, grabbing his coat. Then let's pay Miss Price a visit. Eleanor Price's law office was a sleek, glass-fronted building downtown. When Grayson and Carter arrived, the receptionist led them straight into Eleanor's office, a stylish space filled with books and framed legal diplomas. Eleanor, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, greeted them with a firm handshake. Detective, she said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. I was expecting you. Grayson sat. You said Margaret came to you before she died. Can you tell us why? Eleanor nodded, pulling a file from her desk drawer. Margaret came to me about a month ago. She was worried about a document Richard wanted her to sign. She didn't trust him. Grayson leaned forward. What kind of document? Eleanor slid the file across the desk. A revised power of attorney form. If she signed it, Richard would have had complete control over her finances, her bank accounts, investments, and assets. Grayson scanned the paperwork. Richard had been trying to take over everything. She refused to sign? He asked. She hesitated, Eleanor corrected. But Richard pressured her. She wanted time to think. Grayson's jaw tightened. And did she sign? Eleanor exhaled slowly. I don't know. But 3 days later, she called me again. This time, she sounded terrified. She said she was going on a trip with Richard, but if anything happened to her, I should look into him. Carter shot Grayson a knowing look. Margaret had known she was in danger. Grayson closed the file, his mind racing. He had enough circumstantial evidence to push Richard, but he needed one final piece, something that would break him. He stood. Thank you, Ms. Price. You've been very helpful. As they left the office, Grayson turned to Carter. We need to check Richard's phone records. Carter grinned. Already ahead of you. I put in a request this morning. Grayson smirked. Richard Lawson had made one mistake too many, and now it was only a matter of time. Detective Samuel Grayson sat in his dimly lit office, sipping his third cup of coffee. The evidence was piling up against Richard Lawson, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest, yet. Across from him, Officer Lisa Carter was reviewing Richard's phone records, which had finally come through. Bingo, Carter muttered. Grayson leaned in. What did you find? Carter turned her screen toward him. Richard made multiple calls to a burner phone 2 days before Margaret's death, and then again 2 hours after she went overboard. Grayson narrowed his eyes. Who was on the other end? I traced the burner's location, Carter said, scrolling through the data. You're going to love this. It pinged off a tower near the marina, right where Richard's yacht was docked. And guess who purchased that burner phone? Grayson exhaled. Richard? Carter smirked. Not quite. His mistress, Vanessa Cole. Silence filled the room. A mistress. The missing puzzle piece. Within an hour, Grayson and Carter were parked outside a luxury condo in Miami. The building overlooked the ocean, expensive, sleek, and way out of the price range of someone like Vanessa Cole, an unemployed woman with no visible income. Guess who's footing the bill, Carter said, checking her tablet. Richard Lawson. He's been paying for this place for months, Grayson nodded. Then let's see what Ms. Cole has to say. The door opened after 3 knocks. Vanessa Cole stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe and looking more annoyed than surprised. A woman in her mid-30s, long black hair, striking blue eyes. She was the kind of woman men made bad decisions for. "I was expecting you," she said, crossing her arms. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" Vanessa sighed and stepped aside, letting them in. "I saw the news. I figured you'd come knocking sooner or later." Grayson took a seat across from her, pulling out his notebook. "Let's not waste time, Ms. Cole. What was your relationship with Richard Lawson?" Vanessa gave a slow, knowing smile. "He told you already, didn't he? We've been seeing each other for over a year." Carter scoffed. "While he was still married?" Vanessa shrugged. "Richard and Margaret's marriage was over. He just needed time to clean things up." Grayson leaned forward. "Tell me about the burner phone." Vanessa's expression faltered for the first time. Grayson pushed harder. "You were in contact with Richard before and after Margaret's death. What were you talking about?" Vanessa hesitated, then sighed. "He told me it was almost over, that Margaret had finally signed the papers and that they'd be handling it during their trip." Carter frowned. "Handling it?" Vanessa shrugged. "That's what he said. I didn't ask for details." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "And after Margaret died?" Vanessa looked away. "Richard called me. He sounded relieved. Said everything went according to plan and that we could finally be together." Grayson and Carter exchanged a look. That was it. Richard had planned Margaret's death in advance, and Vanessa had unknowingly confirmed it. Grayson stood. "Ms. Cole, I suggest you don't leave town." Vanessa smirked. "Detective, I'm not stupid. I know exactly how this ends for Richard." Grayson nodded. "Good, because so do we." Back at the precinct, Grayson sat across from Richard Lawson, who had been called in for a few more questions. Richard looked calm, almost cocky, dressed in an expensive suit. "Detective, I've already told you everything. My wife's death was a tragic accident." Grayson placed Vanessa Cole's statement on the table. "Funny because your mistress has a different story." Richard's face twitched. "She told us about the phone calls, the money you sent her, and how you promised her a new life once Margaret was out of the picture." Richard swallowed hard. "She's lying." Grayson smiled. There it was, the crack. He placed another file in front of Richard. "This is a forensic report on your yacht. We found Margaret's fingerprints and nail marks on the railing. She fought for her life before going overboard." Richard's face paled. "Here's what I think," Grayson continued. "You tricked Margaret into signing over her money. When she started getting suspicious, you rushed the plan. You took her on that honeymoon to make it look romantic, then pushed her into the ocean, hoping the current would do the rest." Richard clenched his fists. "Too bad for you," Grayson said, leaning in. "I don't just chase ghosts, I catch killers." Richard exhaled sharply, his confidence finally breaking. And for the first time, he knew he was trapped. Detective Samuel Grayson watched as Richard Lawson's carefully crafted composure crumbled. The once smooth, confident man now sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers clenched into a tight fist. He knew he was cornered. But Grayson wasn't done yet. "You thought this was the perfect crime," he continued, his voice steady. "Take your wife out to sea, get rid of her, and cash in on the $2.5 million insurance payout." He leaned forward. "But you made mistakes, Richard. Too many." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't have a body. Without a body, you have no murder." Grayson smiled. "You're right. No body. Yet." Richard's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Grayson slid a new report across the table. "The Coast Guard recovered something yesterday. A piece of Margaret's red dress, tangled in a fishing net 10 miles from where she fell. And guess what? There were traces of blood on it." Richard's face paled. Carter, standing behind Grayson, chimed in. "See, we thought Margaret just drowned at first, but the blood changes everything. That means she was injured before she hit the water." Richard swallowed hard. "We also checked your yacht again," Grayson added. "This time we brought a forensic team. They found faint traces of blood near the railing, blood that someone tried to wipe away." Silence. Grayson knew Richard was unraveling. He just needed one final push. He pulled out his phone and played a recorded conversation. Vanessa Cole's voice filled the room. He told me it was almost over, that Margaret had finally signed the papers and that they'd be handling it during their trip. After she died, he called me. He sounded relieved. Richard's jaw tightened. She gave you up, Grayson said. She's not going down for you. Richard looked away, his face tense with anger. That bitch. Grayson leaned back. There it was. The first crack in Richard's defense. He decided to hit harder. We also spoke to Margaret's lawyer, Grayson continued. She told us Margaret was worried about signing something Richard gave her. She didn't trust you. Richard shook his head. She signed it on her own. I didn't force her. Grayson smirked. Another mistake. You just admitted she signed something, Carter said. You do realize that, right? Richard's face fell. You might as well come clean, Grayson said, his voice turning serious. We have motive, financial evidence, forensic evidence, and a witness. If you confess now, you might get a deal. Richard gritted his teeth, his shoulders tense. For the first time, he looked like a man who had no way out. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. It was bitter, cold, filled with frustration. You think you're so smart, detective? He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. You don't know what marriage is like. Margaret wasn't some innocent victim. Grayson let him talk. This was it. She controlled everything, Richard continued. I was her damn puppet. She made me feel worthless, constantly reminding me that her money was hers. She was going to cut me off. After everything I put up with? He let out a short, humorless chuckle. She owed me. Carter stared at him in disbelief. You killed your wife because you felt entitled to her money? Richard's smirk faded. He had said too much. Grayson leaned in, his voice calm but firm. That's murder, Richard. No fancy lawyer is going to save you now. Richard's breathing was heavy, his hands trembling. He had played the game, convinced he was too smart to get caught, but now he had just confessed. Grayson stood. Richard Lawson, you're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Lawson. Carter stepped forward, snapping the handcuffs around Richard's wrists. You have the right to remain silent, she said, her voice steady. Richard didn't fight. He just stared at the table, defeated. As Grayson watched him being led away, he felt a familiar satisfaction settle in his chest. Margaret Lawson had almost been erased from existence. Her husband had tried to throw her away like she never mattered. But now, justice was finally catching up to him. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, spectators, and even former friends of Margaret Lawson filled the seats, eager to witness the conclusion of a case that had gripped the entire city. Richard Lawson, dressed in a dark suit, sat at the defendant's table. His usual charm and confidence had long faded. He looked like a man who knew his fate was sealed. Detective Samuel Grayson sat in the gallery, arms crossed, watching as the prosecution delivered its final argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor, Karen Mills, began, walking slowly across the courtroom. Richard Lawson didn't just betray his wife. He executed a cold, calculated plan to murder her for financial gain. She turned toward the jury. We have motive. She held up a document, the insurance policy Margaret unknowingly signed. We have forensic evidence. Photos appeared on the courtroom screen, the blood-stained railing of the yacht, the piece of Margaret's red dress, and a forensic report confirming the presence of blunt force trauma before she hit the water. And we have a confession, Mills said, playing the damning recording of Richard's own words from his interrogation. The jury looked disgusted. Richard's defense attorney stood up, attempting to salvage what little hope was left. There is still no body, he turned to the jury. Without a body, how can we be certain Margaret Lawson is dead? A murmur spread through the courtroom. Grayson sat up straighter. He had anticipated this argument. The prosecutor remained calm. Let's answer that question, shall we? She gestured toward the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open. A forensic pathologist stepped forward, carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a gold wedding ring. Gasps filled the room. It was Margaret's. The forensic expert took the stand and explained. 2 days ago, a fishing crew discovered a skeletal hand tangled in their nets. DNA testing confirmed that it belongs to Margaret Lawson. A chill spread through the courtroom. The jury's expressions hardened. Richard's face went pale. For the first time, his composure cracked completely. His fingers twitched. His breathing turned erratic. He had spent months believing they would never find her. But now, Margaret had come back from the depths, just enough to seal his fate. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Everyone leaned forward in suspense. The forewoman cleared her throat. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Margaret's friends wept with relief. The journalists rushed to report the verdict. Richard slumped in his chair, his face void of emotion. His lawyer whispered something, but he wasn't listening. He was done. Outside the courthouse, Detective Grayson watched as Richard was led to a police van in handcuffs. Reporters shouted questions, but Richard kept his head down. Justice had been served. Carter joined Grayson, shaking her head. "It's crazy, isn't it? How people think they can get away with murder." Grayson nodded. "They always make mistakes. Greed makes people sloppy." He looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. The case was over. Margaret Lawson hadn't died for nothing. Her murderer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And that, Grayson knew, was justice well served.